The Hobart event was particularly significant because it was actually the first time that an Australian state government had said to the anti-women's rights protesters, "You have carte blanche." They had been given a permit for their own area of the ground, and the women had been given another permit. But when it came to it, the police were instructed to not prevent the anti-women people from swarming the women. And so that particular event had to be closed early, and Kelly J said at the time it was the worst Australian event she'd been to. I want to make 3 points. First, IWD Brisbane Meanjin. I began the IWD BM Facebook page in 2017. It's a very small page with low support because it does focus largely on in real life events. My intention was simply to take back the IWD rally and march under the Women's Resistance banner where it had been for 100 years, but had recently been taken over by liberal feminists who argued the case for the state and the big corporations that men could become women. The assertion was and remains clearly regressive, denying as it does that women constitute an oppressed sex class, denying as it does that women and girls have had inflicted on us millennia of unequal treatment, unfavourable treatment, extending to rape and sexual assault, other forms of men's violence, femicide, inferior wage rates, sexual harassment in the workplace, no maternity leave until recently, denial of access to facilities, denial of access to political, economic and social participation, to sport, to awards, and I could go on, as could all of you. We know women and girls are an oppressed sex class, and yet the corporation and state-funded narrative now denies women's oppression and denies biological reality. And liberal feminists, in the same tradition as the women who opposed votes for women more than 100 years ago, have lapped it up. The Queensland government has already passed pieces of legislation and key policy documents that deny women's oppression and that deny sex exists and that erase children's safeguards against fatuous notions that we can choose our sex. And next month, with changes to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Act, the Queensland government will pass another law that establishes the legal fiction that men can become women. We have taken back IWD as a rallying space for genuinely progressive women who are prepared to be part of the fight back against a powerful state-based ideology that is setting our rights back by decades. We're small, of course we're small, and many women, especially but not only public servants, are afraid to come to an IWD rally and march that supports women's rights. Let that sink in. It's 2023 and women are afraid to come to events that support the rights of women and girls, because standing up for women can have and has had workplace consequences, plus family, friendship and physical safety consequences. But the rally and march have expanded to become an annual conference that focuses not only on the harms of gender ideology and sex self-ID, but also on other regressive measures against women, such as the coming full decriminalisation of prostitution without establishing the Nordic model, the harms of pornography and the harms of surrogacy. The rally and march also expanded from 2019 up to now to include occasional meetings that focus on particular issues, such as lesbian women, women in sport, women in prison, and some of those presentations are up on our YouTube channel. You can watch those at your leisure. At the same time, the IWD BM events to mark International Women's Day are probably the only events that Minister for Women Shannon Fentiman excludes from promotion in her annual calendar of events for Women's Week. And this is because IWD BM holds the line that men can't become women, and that some spaces, not all, some spaces must be reserved for women and girls only. And you can see a copy of the letter that Shannon sent me explaining why we were banned from having our events promoted in the annual Women's Week calendar. It's on one of those tables. Since 2018, IWDBM has also hosted a monthly feminist discussion group. We meet in a safe place and we're all anonymous. Our membership waxes and wanes, but we continue. We hold 10 meetings a year, and each of us tries to come to 7 of them. Over the last 2 years, IWDBM hosted 13 street protests against sex self-ID, in addition to the annual IWD rally. And there are photographs around this hall that you can have a look at that show examples of our street activism over the last few years. It's that last group of activities, the street protests, that I've now stopped organising because, apart from the fact that I'm ageing, as a direct result of the Posey Parker tours, there are more mainstream women taking up the struggle, which is fantastic to see. And another Brisbane group has taken on the holding of Speakers Corner events. I don't think they have a Facebook page yet, but you can find them on Twitter. I think it's called Let Women Speak Brisbane. I'm very happy to promote those events whenever I'm asked. In addition, a third group, Defending Women's Rights, may also establish in Brisbane. All this can only add to our grassroots struggle. So to sum up, Brisbane does now have an actual feminist IWD rally, and I don't know any other city in the country that does. They've all had to be closed down because of violent men who've insisted. We also have an annual feminist conference. We have occasional public meetings and we have a monthly feminist discussion group. So while the resistance is tiny, we exist. Second point, feminism, and this may be a little controversial. On social media, I see from some women who are involved in the fight for sex-based rights, that is the gender-critical movement, comments that dismiss and disparage women's liberation theory in politics and feminism, especially radical feminism. I also see disparaging comments about some women's efforts in the struggle. I see these dismissive comments on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. I see women saying things like, you don't have to be a feminist to be in this fight. It's a single issue, unrelated to anything else. Feminism has nothing to do with this fight, and even that feminists are a hindrance to this fight. I've had those comments directed against me personally, and against other women who I know work hard for women's liberation. Now, at one level, it's true. You don't have to know women's liberation theory. You don't have to have been an active radical feminist to know that men can never be women. Gender-critical women don't have to be gender-critical feminists. They're two distinct groups. They're different. But at another level, it's not true that feminism has nothing to do with this struggle. Because when we're talking about women's oppression and women's liberation, there's no such thing as a single issue. They're all connected. And they all lead, in my view, to radical feminism as a framework that shows the history of our resistance and its power. The erasure of women's sex-based rights is not happening in a vacuum. The increase in violent, murderous porn is not happening in a vacuum. The state's refusal to do anything significant to stop men's violence against women is not happening in a vacuum, and nor is the increased sexualisation of little girls and teenagers happening in a vacuum. The Queensland Government will soon introduce full decriminalisation of prostitution and will reject the Nordic model. That isn't happening in a vacuum either. It makes sense to me not only to not be dismissive of women's liberation theory's huge contribution to analysing gender ideology, but also to challenge the attempts to dismiss other women's efforts and invisibilise us. I've recently experienced some denigration because I'm, quote, just an activist. But in my view, doing activist things, organising public meetings and discussions or an annual conference, writing and distributing flyers, etc., is as valid in the struggle as research and writing. They all contribute and there should be no hierarchy. Let's challenge that hierarchy and instead of attacking each other, do work that respects other women's work. Genderism is deeply reactionary and it hits working class and marginalised women first and hardest. It will be to the eternal shame of the far left, which is my own political background, and the middling left, which is the Labour Party, that they abandoned class struggle in favour of privileged identitarianism on the issue of women's oppression. The British Communist Party recently took a strong stand in support of women's sex-based rights, and for some of us who come from a background of Australian communism, that was a very proud moment to read that. The far left in this country should take a leaf from their book, but they won't because they're cowards. Within the UK Labour Party, there's a group of gender-critical women who publicly support women's rights, even though their party overall does not. There's nothing like that in the Australian Labour Party. It behoves women from the left and far left to keep pushing both far-left women and Labour Party women to speak up. We all know members of the Labour Party who know this ideology is dangerous and harmful, but they're all too scared. It's time. And whatever we think of the Greens' leadership, and I'm sure none of us in this room think very much of it, at least there are women and men in the Greens who are speaking out for women and kids. There is no one in the Labour Party who does. The third thing I wanted to mention is the Women's Declaration International, or WDI. You can find the WDI on social media. It's a volunteer global women's organisation that established in 2019 with launches in New York and London. The next year, 2020, it was launched in both Sydney and Brisbane. The Brisbane launch was at our annual conference. It's the only grassroots global organisation I know of that defends women's sex-based rights and children's safeguards. Its declaration for women's sex-based rights is available to sign online, and if you haven't already signed it, I'd encourage you to do so. It's got about 35,000 signatures right now, and it's based on CEDAW, the Convention Against the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and that's a UN document. So even though the Australian government and many state governments in Australia, including the Queensland government, have violated CEDAW, it's actually law. It's a UN document. Anna McCormack is from the Feminist Legal Clinic in Sydney, and she's our country rep for the WDI, and if you've signed the declaration, you can go on to Anna's email list, which is a useful source of information, and you'll find opportunities to be involved.